Hello. Before turning to Strindberg and the Father today, I want to address a question that I received about the ending of Woyzeck from a member of the class. I noted that after murdering Marie, the always conflicted Woyzeck is torn between two sides of what he calls his double nature. The enlightened human in him is stricken with guilt, while his animal nature fills him with a survival instinct. Now, this conflict produces contradictory behavior, as I explained last time. Woyzeck's guilty conscience moves him to appear in a tavern covered with blood in order to expose, almost to confess his crime. But his survival instinct then causes him to say that he cut himself and flee, and then to try to hide the knife by throwing it deeper and deeper into the pond. But the more complex manifestation of this inner conflict is revealed in Woyzeck's inconsistent responses to Marie's dead body. And this is what the question wanted me to elaborate upon. Struggling with his guilt, Woyzeck tries to remove that guilt in three different and quite contradictory ways. First, by disavowing the killing altogether, by talking to Marie as if she wasn't dead and could still hear him. "Why are you so pale, Marie?" he asks. But a moment later, he tries to negate his guilt in a different way, by suggesting, like Othello, that he killed her as an act of justice. Her sins made her black, he says, and her cut throat is a necklace that he gave her as a punishment for sinning with the drum major. But then a moment after that, his guilt returns more powerfully, and he tries to expunge it by washing away the blood. "I have to wash myself," he says, going to the lake. There's a spot, there's a spot. Now, all three of these attempts are really attempts to negate the force of conscience driven by Woyzeck's survival instinct, a kind of animal fear of death. Even though, paradoxically, he has consciously wanted to die throughout the play, his survival instinct keeps him alive and even produces the most bizarre of all contradictions in which Marie seems to be both dead and not dead, both sentient and beyond all contact. Okay, now, Strindberg. We turn now to August Strindberg, a prolific Swedish playwright and man of letters whose dramas evolved and changed over 3 decades. They changed from works of naturalistic theater, like his celebrated play Miss Julie in the mid-1880s, which explores the dynamics of class and gender warfare at a country manor house, changes from naturalistic plays like that to experimental works like a dream play at the turn of the century. It is a flamboyant, plotless drama filled with strange symbols and expressionistic effects that are meant to dramatize the workings of the unconscious mind. And it was written just a few years after Freud published his classic study of the dream unconscious, the interpretation of dreams. Now, what remains consistent in Strindberg's best work, through all of his changing dramatic styles, is his vision of the strife, the tragic struggle at the heart of life. And he regards this struggle as occurring both within individuals, and between individuals. Now, as in The Father, this conflict is often a struggle between the sexes. For Strindberg, it was a combat between men and women to the death, because by the time he wrote The Father in 1888, this combat had become an obsession with him. And also, he was seized at this time in his career with a paranoid fear that women were trying to destroy him. He became convinced that they not only, women, had an inherent biological advantage over men in the competition for life, but that women also had an inborn desire to disempower and destroy men, quite apart from their need to survive, almost a kind of inborn inimical hatred of men. Now, The Father is both fascinating and repellent in its exploration of this conflict. It was written in a pitch of anti-female hysteria in Strindberg's life, and I think that's pretty evident. The captain's scheming wife, Laura, arouses and preys upon her husband's paranoid fears, and she does so cunningly that she drives him into a state of helpless insanity. And indeed, it seems that Strindberg is in many ways close to his protagonist here, certainly close enough to the captain to regard him and cast him as a tragic hero in this struggle, this doomed struggle against his wife. But what makes Strindberg's vision of women as maddening destroyers so strange and so surprising when this play came out is this. Just 4 years earlier, Strindberg had been brought to trial by a Swedish court for writing in favor of women's suffrage and for advocating the equality of the sexes. Such egalitarian views in late 19th century Sweden's patriarchal culture were regarded as threats to the well-being of the state. Now, Strindberg was also derided about this same time for breaking from the National Lutheran Church and boldly declaring his atheism. Well, you might wonder what happened in the years leading up to The Father to change Strindberg's views about gender relations and women so radically. Well, first, in the mid-1880s, he embraced the work of the French naturalist novelist Émile Zola, who held that a writer should take a scientific view of life, and this meant regarding human social relations as governed by the same laws of heredity and the same struggle for dominance that Darwin had described operating in the natural world in his Origin of Species, hence the term naturalism. Now, note that whereas we have kind of proto-Darwinian hints in Woyzeck, Woyzeck was written 30 years before The Origin of the Species, which was published in 1859, and The Father was written almost 30 years afterward. And there's no question in Strindberg's case that he is influenced by Darwin and echoing Darwinian thought, but filtered through Zola's lens of naturalism. Now, when Strindberg applied Zola's scientific method to the world that he knew, he came to the conclusion that the conflict that Darwin saw as inherent in natural selection, that is, the survival of the fittest, in the world of animals and plants, was also occurring in human society. But for Strindberg, this struggle was not between different species, but rather between the two different sexes. He believed that men and women were, by their very nature, inimical to each other, always locked in a struggle for dominance and supremacy, as well as simple survival. During this period, and in the years just before The Father, a second influence occurred that helps to explain his anti-feminist hysteria here. Strindberg suffered from what he described as an inferno crisis, a temporary lapse into insanity marked by hallucinations and by paranoid fears that his wife, who was an actress, was betraying him with other men. Not surprisingly, they separated, during which time Strindberg rescinded his earlier support of women's rights and denounced the entire female gender in print as, quote, half-apes, cruel, instinctive, evil animals. Looking back, Strindberg realized that he'd lost his mind and that his instability was exacerbated by his heavy drinking of absinthe, which was a readily available and often prescribed medicinal for bad nerves, but it was highly addictive because it was essentially opium distilled in alcohol. But Strindberg's fearful misogynistic antagonism against women didn't end when he returned to something like sanity. And he suffered another fit of madness some years later in the mid-1890s, at which time he seems to have experimented on himself with various psychotropic drugs. Pretty interesting biography. Now, not long after that, Strindberg changed direction again, though not toward women, but toward religion. He became a religious mystic. This individual who had declared his atheism, now religious mystic because he became inspired by the writings of the Swedish theologian Emanuel Swedenborg. But he went beyond Swedenborg, did Strindberg, to develop his own visionary belief system, in so doing embracing the very mysticism and irrationalism that in The Father he associates with women and so derides. Well, casting off his atheism in this regard, he did not cast off his misogyny. Nonetheless, Strindberg believed, as a mystic, that he was receiving special transmissions from some Godhead beyond that had chosen him, Strindberg, to atone for the sins of mankind, thereby at least giving him the belief that there was some purpose and meaning to his mental torment and his persecution complex. Well, except for a period of writer's block in the 1890s, Strindberg continued to compose plays throughout his career and through all of his psychic turbulence. Indeed, along with the great Norwegian contemporary Henrik Ibsen, who we'll be turning to next, Strindberg is one of the undisputed fathers of modern psychological drama. Like Bickner, in Woyzeck, Strindberg was ahead of his time in understanding the psychology of inner conflicts, the power of unconscious motivations, and the ways in which a man can be driven to madness by doubt and obsession. Also, like Woyzeck, which the father resembles in certain ways, the play is presented as the tragedy of a decent man who suffers overwhelming mental agony as he tries and fails to cling to his reason in a brutal, irrational world, one that both exists around him and in him as well. Okay, well, as we turn now to Act 1 of The Father, note Strindberg's specific and detailed instructions for the interior of the captain's sitting room where the play opens. The accoutrements here tell us a good deal about the inhabitant. The sitting room at the captain's. There is a door a little to the right at the back, and in the middle of the room a large round table strewn with newspapers and magazines. To the right, a leather-covered sofa and table. In the right-hand corner, a private door. At left, there is a door leading to the inner room and a desk and a clock on it. Game bags and guns and other arms hang on the walls. Army coats hang near the door. On the large table stands a lighted lamp. Now, in a house full of women, the captain's study is a kind of retreat, a hyper-masculine domain. Not unexpected, one might say, in a man who, like Othello, is a military commander. The leather sofa, the game bags, the guns of various kinds are stereotypically masculine, even phallic. The newspapers and magazines suggest that the captain stays informed, even though he's been stationed in a rather remote outpost in the Swedish countryside. Indeed, we soon learn that he is also a serious scientific researcher, and the lighted lamp, which will become an important symbol in the play, indicates that the captain is a man who lives, one might say, by the light of reason in a house filled with women who practice various forms of religion and mysticism. The captain, like Strindberg at this point, is an atheist, as he makes clear when, in his opening discussion with his brother-in-law, the pastor, he explains that for him there is no importance in the Word of God. They're discussing the soldier Najd, who has been accused of impregnating a local girl, and the pastor says, "And so you want me to preach to him? What effect do you suppose the Word of God will have on a rough trooper?" The captain says, "Well, it certainly has no effect on me." "I know that well enough," says his rather indignant brother-in-law. Now, note that when Nord comes in, he defends himself by introducing a concept that implants a terrible doubt in the captain's brain, one that Laura will exploit in order to destroy him. It's the fact, as Njord explains it, that a woman is always sure a child is hers because it comes out of her body, but a man can never be sure that he's the father. After all, how many men might that woman have been with? Indeed, from this perspective, the play's title is ironic, The Father, because the legitimacy of fatherhood is in doubt for the captain, as it is ultimately for any other man. Njord mentions this when the captain asks him about this impregnated woman whom he's accused of sleeping with and impregnating Emma. "Oh, so it was Emma, then, who led you astray, was it?" "Well, not far from it," says Njord. "You know that unless the girl's willing, nothing ever happens." "Never mind all that. Are you the father of this child or not?" "Who knows?" "What's that? Don't you know?" "Why, no, that is, you can never be sure." "Were you the only one?" "Yes, that time, but you can't be sure for all of that." See here, Njord," says the pastor, "you surely ought to know whether you're the father or not." To which Njord says, "Well, of course I was mixed up with the girl, but you know yourself, pastor, that it needn't amount to anything for all of that." He says, "Yes, if only I knew for sure that I was the father of the child, but you can't be sure of that, pastor, and I don't see much fun slaving all your life for another man's child." Njord's response here, it's particularly his phrase, "who knows," gets at the essence of the problem that men face for Strindberg. How can a man ever be sure that another man hasn't sired the child that he thinks is his? How can he ever be sure the woman hasn't had sex with another man? Because, as Njord said, you can't tell for sure. He asserts you can never know because it may or may not be another man's child. This notion, after all, is deeply rooted, say, in the Jewish tradition, where you're only a Jew if your mother is a Jew, because after all, how, at least before genetic testing, could one ever know if indeed the figure who you think of your father really biologically is? Now, the captain, talking to Njord, says, you ought to know. Yes, you really ought to know. But only Emma, only the woman, can be certain that the baby is hers. And for Strindberg, this inescapable fact gives women a tremendous biological advantage in the struggle between the sexes. The captain is disturbed by this interview because he says he, quote, can't ferret out the truth, and it's, quote, not to my liking. No. In fact, anything that can't be determined with certainty isn't to his liking. He's a male rationalist and scientist. He can't bear anything that's ambiguous, anything that's uncertain, theoretically or personally. And this, in this respect, one might say, the captain resembles both Woyzeck and Othello in the intolerance of ambiguity and the impatience to know and affirm something for sure. Now, in the fact of uncertainty about Njord, the captain tries to take refuge in two things. The first is the law, which is written and enforced by males. And the second is his misogynist idea that whether or not Njord is guilty of impregnating this woman, the woman is certainly guilty for getting pregnant. Upon my soul, he says, I should like to be in the magistrate's shoes and judge this case. The lad is probably not innocent. One can't be sure, but we do know that the girl is guilty. If there's any guilt, it's assigned to her. Now, note that although women have a biological advantage in their knowledge that a child is theirs, Sweden is nonetheless a patriarchy. And as the head of household, the captain has the legal right over his daughter Bertha, whom he would like to save from the toxic influence of his wife and the women in the house by sending off to become a teacher in town. Now, throughout the play, Strindberg plays with the conflict between male legal authority and female natural power, only to show that whatever legality may assign to male, female natural power and the natural advantages women have in nature is much stronger than any legal advantage that men might seem to have. The captain senses this female power in the house. He sees women as inherently destructive, as irrational and coercive, and he wants to save his daughter from the women in the house, and especially from Laura. Now, at this point, the captain has no doubts that Bertha is really his child, but the influence around her distresses him. And so he tells the pastor, this house is full of women, all of whom want to have their say about my child. My mother-in-law wants to make a spiritualist of her. Laura wants her to be an artist. The governess wants her to be a Methodist. Old Margaret a Baptist, and the servant girls wanted to join the Salvation Army. It won't do to try to make a soul in patches like that. I, who have the chief right to form her character, am constantly opposed in my efforts, and that's why I've decided to send her away from the house. And when the pastor says, you have too many women trying to run this house, he says, you're right. It's like going into a cage full of tigers, and if I didn't have a red-hot iron under their noses, they would tear me to pieces in a moment. And on top of that, I've got my old nurse into the bargain, who treats me as if I still wear a bib. Okay. Now, note here that the captain clearly fears female power and aggression. He says the women in the house would tear him to pieces if they could. They're like tigers, and he has to constantly fend them off. This is the first of many animal images that Strindberg uses to describe or evoke the Darwinian struggle between species in nature, occurring between men and women in a supposedly civilized society. Women in this struggle are inevitably cast as predators in the conflict, like tigers. They may traffic in mysticism, but they are really, he suggests, out for blood, under the surface of what might seem to be a kind of dreamy irrationality. They will dig their teeth into you, he suggests, and kill you. Now, the captain fears that the teenage Bertha is going to become like her mother, while he wants to send her out of the house to train to become a teacher, to become independent, so that if she doesn't marry, she will be a productive member of the social order. At the end of the passage I just read, the captain mentions his old nurse who lives with the family. And here, when he says she treats me as if I still wear a bib, he unknowingly touches upon a second huge biological advantage that Strindberg believes that women have over men. She treats him like a baby, but what Strindberg is going to reveal is that men secretly crave that infantilization and that women know it, that this reduction to helplessness is rooted not just in the female desire for maternal dominance, but in a male desire to surrender to it. It's rooted in a bond that a woman forms with her child when she is nursing the child, and thereafter the child unconsciously longs to return to the maternal breast. Even the most independent and fiercely rational men like the captain. Indeed, we'll see that this is indeed true of the captain and that Laura exploits that particular advantage, the male longing for infantilization back to the female breast, just as she also exploits the captain's inability to know for sure whether or not he is Bertha's father. Now, already Laura has been trying to incapacitate and emasculate the captain, we're told, by treating me as if I were an invalid. She's treated me for the past 20 years as if I were on the point of death, he complains to his brother-in-law. The effect of this treatment, again, treating him as if he is somehow weak and infirm, is something that is meant to contribute to the captain's emasculation, his psychological instability, and it certainly contributes to his distrust of women. Now, at this point, Bertha is already a weapon in the captain's war against his wife and hers against him. The child is caught in this bitter tug of war and is distressed at it. The captain says, well, anyway, the whole house is topsy-turvy. Laura won't let Bertha leave her, and I can't allow her to remain in this bedlam. And then, by way of a disclaimer, he tells the captain, you mustn't think that I want to make of Bertha a prodigy or an image of myself. I don't want to be a procurer for my daughter and educate her exclusively for matrimony, for then, if she were left unmarried, she might have bitter days. No, I want her to be a teacher if she remains unmarried. That way she'll be able to support herself. Now, you'll note here that while the captain wants to save Bertha from becoming like Laura, he denies that he's trying to cast her in his own image. But he really isn't being honest when he says this, as we see, because later we find that he actually would like to see his intellectual interests reflected in Bertha, because she is his legacy. She's what he wants to survive after he dies. But even more, we're going to see that the captain will grow increasingly desperate to see himself not just in Laura's mind, but more and more to see himself reflected in her physical features, so as to try to assuage the doubts that he has as to whether or not he is really her father. Here's how the captain puts it to the old nurse when he is concerned about his relationship with his child. He says, you see, it isn't enough for me to have given the child Bertha life. I want to give her my soul too. Well, clearly, in wanting to give her soul, he wants to see himself reflected in her in a way that is troublingly narcissistic, but then Laura wants to see herself reflected in the child as well, in an even more emphatically narcissistic way. Well, soon the captain won't be sure that he even gave life to Bertha at all. When Laura enters for the first time, the captain tries to put her in her place by reminding her of his legal authority over Bertha, a tactic that not only angers Laura, but in doing so fortifies her drive to destroy him. In their first conversation, he says, according to the law, children are to be brought up by their father's faith. His faith is rationalism. Laura says, and the mother has no voice in the matter? None whatever. She has sold her birthright by a legal transaction when she got married and forfeited her right to return for the man's responsibility of caring for her and the children. To which Laura says, that's to say she has no rights concerning the child? The captain says, no, none at all. When once she has sold her goods by getting married, one cannot have them back and still keep the money. He regards this as transactional. I marry and support you. In exchange, the law awards me jurisdiction over our child. Now, just as the captain seems to have enforced patriarchal authority in this little speech, in this declaration, just then he makes a tragic mistake. This is his hamartia in Aristotelian terms, if you will. Why? Well, when Laura asks what Njord had wanted, the captain makes the mistake of explaining it, and in so doing, he gives Laura the key to destroying him, something that Laura had not thought of before. The captain asks, it's not written in the law who the child's father is, to which Laura says, but one usually knows that. Wise minds claim one can never know. Really, Laura says, that's strange. Can't one ever know who the father of their child is? No, so they claim. How extraordinary, Laura says. How can the father have such control over children then if they can't even be sure that they're theirs? The captain says he has control only when he's assumed the responsibilities of the child or has them forced upon him. But in wedlock, of course, there is no doubt about fatherhood. To which she says, there are no doubts then? Well, I should hope not. Well, if the wife has been unfaithful, that's another matter. Was there anything else you wanted? It's a great scene, and I hope it reminded you a little bit of something in Othello. One can see Laura's mind working here, very much as we saw Iago's mind work, as she creates the first doubts in the captain about his fatherhood by asking the kinds of questions, leading questions, that Iago asks as he is tempting Othello into jealousy. She asks, are there no doubts about paternity in marriage? What if the wife has been unfaithful? Now that word unfaithful that she uses sticks in his mind. It preys on the captain's mind hereafter, the way the word cuckold and jealousy do in Othello. And it seems clear then that Strindberg, I think, had that scene in Othello in mind, the first temptation scene, its first destabilization of Othello's mind, in mind as he was writing this one. Now, we see a sign that the captain's uncertainties are actually beginning to emerge when at the end of that scene I just read, he abruptly breaks off the conversation. What else did you want? And then flees to his study. What had been a merely theoretical problem of paternity, the idea that, yes, perhaps in an abstract sense a man can never be sure, has now become distressingly personal. The irony is that just as Njord planted the idea of a man's inability to affirm his paternity in the captain's mind, so too now in telling Njord's story, the captain unintentionally plants that same idea in Laura's mind, and in so doing, he gives her the primary instrument to destroy him. Now, in order to gain control of Bertha, Laura knows that she needs not just the natural power of a woman, but she also needs legal power. And one way to acquire that is to prove that the male head of household, who by law can determine the destiny of his children, that he's insane. If he's insane, then he is no longer in charge. Thus, Laura attempts to get the local doctor to confirm the captain's madness through a series of outrageous lies about him. She would like the doctor, she says, to move into the house so that he could observe the captain even more closely, and in observing him, be also close to her where she can fill his ear with lies. Now, although the doctor is a male, and although he is in fact a man of science who would seem to be a natural ally of the captain, he proves to be as easy a dupe in Laura's plan to destroy her husband as Creon was in Medea's plan to destroy Jason. Consider this conversation in which Laura claims, you see, my husband has sometimes the most extraordinary ideas, which, of course, one might expect in a learned man if they did not have a disastrous effect on the welfare of the whole family. For instance, one of his whims is buying all kinds of things. That is serious. What does he buy? Whole boxes of books that he never reads. Tell me, do you think, Doctor, it's reasonable that one can see what is happening on another planet by looking through a microscope? Does he say he can do that? Yes, that's what he says. Through a microscope? Through a microscope, yes. Oh, this is serious. This is serious. Very serious. Has he ever shown any symptoms of indecision or instability of will? Now the doctor's quite concerned. Now, note here The doctor is unknowingly playing into Laura's hands when, based on the claims I've just read, he cautions her to avoid the following. Avoid suggesting to the captain any ideas that might make a deep impression and quickly turn into a monomania or fixed idea, end quote. Now, what the doctor cautions against here, of course, is now exactly what Laura plans to put into practice. That is, to insinuate that Bertha might not be the captain's child until that insinuation becomes a mania, a fixed idea, and finally a source of full-blown madness. When the doctor asks the captain about Laura's allegations, the captain explains the true nature of his scientific research, which in fact is rather impressive. The captain says, "I believe I am now really on a track of a discovery." Indeed. Yes, you see, I've submitted meteoric stones to spectrum analysis with the result that I have found carbon, that is to say, clear trace of organic life. What do you say to that? Can you see that with a microscope? Well, Lord, no, with a spectroscope. Oh, the spectroscope, pardon. Then you'll be able to tell us, say what's happening on Jupiter? Not what is happening, but what has happened, as evident in the rocks. Ah, okay. Geological and astronomical explorations, not the crazy thing that Laura had suggested. Now, we soon learn that Laura has been impeding this research of the captain's by holding back book deliveries and by intercepting the captain's correspondence with other scientists, all in an attempt to isolate him, subvert his work, and weaken him mentally through frustration. In his isolation, the captain sometimes takes refuge in this house full of women in the old nurse, the only one he feels he can talk to. But rather than reassuring him on this occasion, the nurse reinforces the natural power of women by emphasizing a mother's bodily bond with her child in infancy. The old nurse says, a father can sometimes find things besides his child, but a mother has nothing but her child. The nurse knows that the captain, who nursed at this woman's own breast, still secretly craves the maternal breast, longs to revert to infantile dependency, and so she encourages this, speaking to him as if at times he were a little boy. And there's something about it that he likes. He keeps coming back to her. The captain says to her, "I want to give my child my soul. Do you understand?" And she says, "Oh, Lord, what are you saying, Mr. Adolf? Do you think I can forget that you were my child when you were little?" The captain says, "Well, you dear, have I forgotten it? No, you've been like a mother to me and always have stood by me when everybody else was against me. But now, when I really need you, you seem to desert me to go over to the enemy." And then the nurse says, "Oh, well, don't be ashamed of yourself. You ought to be ashamed of yourself for saying that. But in spite of everything, old Margaret still cares most for her big boy, and he will come back to the fold when it's stormy weather." Stormy weather. Come back, big boy. She infantilizes him. She later says, quote, "All you men, great and small, are women's children." And she treats him like an infant, and there's a part of him that is clearly attracted to that. Along with Laura, the nurse understands the effects of what the nurse describes as the intensely physical bond between a mother and a child, or a mother figure, in her case, in a child, whoever suckles at the maternal breast. Because a mother has only her child, the nurse explains, she prizes and protects that child and her bond with it above all things, clearly as Laura does with Bertha. The bond, therefore, becomes indissoluble. It seems to become more powerful than any bond a father can forge with the child because it is rooted in biological bondedness. Now, even though Bertha tells the captain that, quote, "I should love to go to town and away from here," the fact is that she doesn't act on it because she doesn't want to counter her mother Laura's wishes, and caught then between them, she suffers over the parents' conflicting wills and plans for her. Thus, Bertha remains in the house, where the captain tells Laura, quote, "I know you possess the power of changing Bertha's mind to suit your pleasure. It's a fiendish power." And indeed, she is in the process of changing Bertha's mind so that soon Bertha does not seem to want to leave at all. The problem is that the memory of the mother-child bond that Laura exploits with Bertha resides not just in the mother, but as I've noted, in the child as well, and not just in Bertha, but also in the captain himself. The captain himself has to struggle against his own desire to surrender to the maternal female, both the nurse and, as we'll also see, to surrender in a kind of infantile way to Laura, whom he once regarded as a mother figure. Now, at the end of his conversation with the nurse, like a child, like a frightened child, the captain begs her, "Help me," because he says, "I feel evil is coming in this house of women." He says, I know, but something evil is on the way. But of course, he's saying this to a woman. Now, as I've noted, the captain is desperate to send Bertha away from this haunted house, both to shape her as a version of himself, but also to keep her from becoming an irrational, power-hungry female like her mother. Laura's insistence that Bertha stay at home in a domain of women also has a double motive. She isn't just concerned with controlling the destiny of the couple's teenage daughter and making her like herself. It is also rooted in Laura's deep resentment of patriarchy and her hatred of the male principles that the captain embodies: military discipline, reason, the search for scientific truth, and a sense of legal entitlement. All of those things embodied in him she despises. All of them are aspects of patriarchy that she rebels against. Like the captain, as I've suggested, she wants to shape the child into her own image, and she's afraid that if Laura goes outside the house, she will, quote, be taught that everything her mother has implanted in her is mere foolishness. In the same way, the captain fears if she stays in the house, everything he's tried to teach her by way of reason and science and logic will be forfeited. Now, the captain's rationality and truth-seeking may be admirable human ideals, but Strindberg suggests that they're not effective weapons in a world governed not by the laws of man, but by the laws of the jungle, which in this play, of course, is the natural struggle between men and women as different and, if as it were, competing species. This conflict is intrinsically tragic for men because beyond the two empowering biological advantages that women enjoy, specifically the certainty that a child is their own and the lasting maternal bond that creates a need in the child, beyond that, there's a third gendered advantage that emerges that women also have and that seems intrinsic in them and to give them an advantage. And that is a capacity the captain and Laura both agree upon in women for deception, a kind of superior capacity for guile, very much as Medea had suggested in Euripides. Now, caught in her parents' fierce struggle, Bertha hasn't yet shown the female traits that Strindberg associates with womanhood: superstition, irrationalism, and deceit. In fact, just as the captain, in the scene I just read, is asking the nurse to help him because he feels evil is on the way, Bertha rushes in to ask for his protection. Quote, "Help me, save me," she says. Bertha's frightened and repelled by her grandmother's spiritualism and by her attempt to make her a part of it by serving as a medium for spirits of dead souls that her grandmother believes inhabit the house, mainly the attic. Bertha's resistance to this superstition, this irrationalism, poses the question of whether such traits really are intrinsic in females, as Strindberg largely suggests, or whether they are acquired, in which case Bertha seems to have been restrained from a full immersion in them by her father's influence, even though she's saturated in a house full of spiritual and religious thinking. But Laura's influence is stronger than the captain's, just as her will is stronger. Act 1 ends with Laura's open assault on the captain's sanity, a full-scale assault now, as she awakens his anxiety over whether Bertha really is his child. At the end, we get this conversation. Laura says, "Is Bertha really to leave home now?" "Yes, she's to start in a fortnight," he said. "That is your decision." "Yes." "Then I must try to prevent it." "You cannot." "Can't I? Do you really think I would trust my daughter to wicked people who would sort of teach her everything or make fun of everything that I've tried to teach her? No. It's important that she stay here." "Why so?" the captain says. "Because the mother is closer to the child, as it has been discovered that no one can tell for a certainty who the father of a child is." The captain responds, "How does that apply in this case?" "Do you not know whether you are Bertha's father or not?" "I do not know." "No. What no one knows, you surely cannot know." "Are you joking?" "No, I'm only making use of your own teaching. For that matter, how do you know that I have not been unfaithful to you?" "I believe you're capable of almost anything, Laura, but not that, and nor that you would talk about it if you were unfaithful, nor that you would talk about it if it were true." To which Laura replies, "Suppose that I was prepared to bear anything, even to being despised and driven out, everything for the sake of being able to keep and control my child, and that I am truthful now when I declare that Bertha is my child, but not yours. Suppose I were to do that." Okay. Now, let us unpack this rich scene. Laura refuses to say whether Bertha is the captain's child or not. But she tells the captain that in order to gain custody of their daughter, she might be willing to claim that indeed he isn't the father. She'd be willing, she says, to bear the scorn of being labeled an adulterous woman and being driven out, just so she could control the child, and do so because he would lose all legal custody if he weren't the father. Now, what destabilizes the captain's psyche here isn't primarily jealousy at the prospect that she was unfaithful. He tries to deny it, but then he says, but you're capable of almost anything. It's not sexual jealousy, because after all, he doesn't love Laura the way Othello or Wojciech loved their women. No, rather, Laura preys on what she knows are the captain's specific points of vulnerability, and jealousy is not one of them. They are these. First, as a man of science who seeks knowledge in facts, the captain cannot bear to live in uncertainty, and she's just plunged him into it by saying, "Are you really sure that you're Bertha's father?" "You might not be." Second, she preys upon the fact that he's terrified at the prospect of humiliation. If she publicly claimed that he wasn't the father, the shame of being a cuckold within the patriarchal order would be more painful for him than the shame of adultery would be for her. And finally, she preys upon the fact that the captain is afraid of losing legal power if she made such a claim. The one advantage a man seems to have over a wife under patriarchy is the law, but if Laura declared that he wasn't Bertha's father, he would lose that. Now, note that he thinks she's capable of making such a claim, but we realize, of course, that Laura plans to do no such thing. Her real plan for gaining legal power doesn't require that self-exposure or humiliation. She intends rather to wrest legal authority from him by getting the captain declared insane, and this is precisely what she's working toward in this scene. Now, Laura's hatred of the captain and her capacity for cruelty runs so deep that just in order to disempower him isn't enough. She also wants to make him suffer along the way. Thus, in the passage I read, she reminds him that he foolishly gave her the idea that a man can't be sure that a child is his own. Quote, "I'm only making use of your own teaching. How do you know that I haven't been unfaithful to you?" What fuels her hatred, you might say? What fuels this desire to inflict pain and not simply gain control of the child? Well, for Strindberg, that kind of hatred and aggression in women is partly innate. It's an expression of the inevitable war, the eternal war between men and women. Laura despises the captain because he's a man, and as a woman, she naturally feels superior to him. In fact, she seems to resent the fact that men presumably wield legal authority when in fact they are, by all natural means, contemptibly weak, far inferior to women. Now, part of Laura's superiority as a woman is her ability to adapt to changing circumstances, part of that natural guile that I noted. And not unlike Iago, what we find Laura capable of doing as she weaves her plot to destroy the captain's mind is make use of new pieces of information in this evolving scheme, including, as we saw at the beginning of the play, the mention that he makes of Njord's claim that men can never know their paternity. Now, in the Darwinian world of the play, then, this female adaptability that we find in Laura makes her far better suited to survive than the rigid inflexibility of her husband. For Darwin, one of the things that leads some members of a species or certain species to survive in the face of change is adaptability. Well, the captain shows his understanding of women's manifold superior power in the play's most explicit application of Darwinian theory to this intergender conflict, when he puts it this way. When the captain says, "Do you hate me?" she says, "Yes, sometimes, when you are a man," implying that I hate you because you are a man, but sometimes, you're so pathetic that you're not really a man. The captain says, "This is like race hatred. If it is true that we are descended from monkeys, as Darwin argued, at least it must be from two separate species of monkey. We're certainly not like one another, are we?" "What do you mean by all this?" The captain says, "I feel that one of us must go under in this struggle." "Which?" "The weaker, of course," the captain says. And the captain knows that he is, of course, as a male, the weaker. Now, this exchange makes gender warfare seem almost impersonal, as if all men and all women must be locked in this struggle. And to some extent that is true. But we're going to discover in Act 2 that there is a more personal source for Laura's hatred, one that goes beyond the universal male-female conflict that the captain just described, and that goes even beyond the struggle between her and the captain over Bertha's destiny. Rather, we'll see that there is something that propels her aggression and her cruelty and her drive for power over him that is rooted in personal revenge. Now, at the end of Act 1, the distraught captain orders a sleigh and plunges out into the snow in this December evening in order to escape the House of Women. But of course, at this point, he cannot escape his oppressive doubts about his paternity. As Laura has preyed upon them, they are becoming a mania. Act 2 opens with Laura telling more lies about the captain to the doctor in an attempt to have him declared insane. The gullible physician again accepts Laura's lies and again inadvertently advances her plans by telling her that it would be dangerous if in any way you were to speed the captain's fall into madness by doing the following. If he discovers your secret interference in his affairs, he will have grounds for suspicions, and they will grow like an avalanche. Besides, in doing this, you will have thwarted his will and irritated him still more. No, someone in his unstable condition should not be confronted with the fact that you have been trying to subvert his work all along. Whatever you do, don't let him know that. Well, of course, this is precisely what she does. And when the captain, and when the doctor a little later mentions a certificate of lunacy, it's not so much that that plants an idea. She pretends as she didn't know what it was, but she certainly did, but that it makes it all the more compelling that the doctor is actually considering this possibility, even as she plays innocent. Now, note the doctor gives her the idea of deepening the captain's mental instability by telling her what she shouldn't do, and she can then do it, inverting his advice by allowing the captain in the next scene to find out that she has indeed thwarted his scientific work by interfering with his correspondence. Now, given Strindberg's depiction of how easily women deceive men and how naturally powerful they are, one has to wonder in this play how patriarchy ever came into existence in the first place. Why, if women enjoy the natural advantages, the biological advantages that I've suggested, are we not living in a matriarchy? Well, Strindberg never really confronts that question, curiously. Another sign of Laura's increasing power and control is the change that we see in Bertha, who now embraces the mystical and irrational forces in the house, which she had earlier sought her father's protection against. She says now, quote, "I believe spirits are at work. I heard someone singing in the attic or in the storeroom near where the cradle stands." All right. This is clearly a manifestation of the atmosphere in which she lives and an indication of the captain's waning influence. Meanwhile, like Othello, the captain tries to relieve his intolerable uncertainty about his paternity by finding some proof that he actually is Laura's biological father. He looks at a photograph of Bertha, which would seem to offer some objective indication of a physical, biological resemblance to him. But even the nurses claim that he and Bertha, quote, look like two peas in a pod, exactly the same. Given his state of mind now, even that corroboration isn't enough. After all, even the paternity of the nurse's own child, she admits, is questionable. She doesn't know who the father could be. So how then, again, he wonders, can a man ever be sure? Now, in a play set a full century before genetic testing, science, the captain's light of the world, offers him no reassuring proof of paternity any more than that photograph does. Instead, when he's talking to the doctor, the captain tries to think about paternity in scientific terms and comes to some disquieting conclusions. Because instead of finding that he can in some way talk him into a belief in his own fatherhood of Bertha through science, at least as he presents it here, seems only to establish the impossibility of ever knowing based on any visible evidence at all. Here's what he says. The captain says, "Doctor, is it true that you can obtain striped foals if you cross a zebra and a mare?" The doctor, astonished. "Perfectly true. And is it true that the foals continue to be striped if the breed is continued with a stallion?" Doctor says, "Yes, that's true too." That is to say, under certain conditions, a stallion can be sire to striped foals, or the opposite. The doctor says, "Yes, so it seems." And the captain concludes, "Therefore, an offspring's likeness to the father proves nothing." Now, this is a very strange conversation and one that does very little credit to the doctor's powers of reasoning, because the captain is not making a whole lot of sense here. He's not thinking quite rationally. Within the analogy that he sets up, it appears that he is thinking of Laura as the mare, himself as the zebra, and some other male sexual partner as the stallion, who could be the father, even though Laura looks a lot like the captain. Well, this animal analogy seems illogical because it involves two generations of reproduction, not one. And the captain's scientific mind here seems to be breaking down under the weight of his obsessive doubt and confusion, and the rather abashed doctor, in acceding to these not very clear or rational points, only seems to be fomenting the captain's uncertainty. Now, at this point, the captain is already so unable to bear the state of doubt that he's ready to surrender to Laura, ready to give up the struggle to control Bertha, if only Laura will relieve his doubts. He tells the doctor that he will, if she'll do that, surrender to her power that he's been fighting for so long, surrender to it quietly. The doctor says, "Captain, your thoughts are taking a morbid turn. You ought to control them." The captain says, "You must not use the word morbid. Steam boilers, as you know, explode at a certain pressure, but the same pressure is not needed for all steam boilers. Do you understand? Unfortunately, I am a man, and there is nothing for me to do but, like a Roman, fold my arms across my breast and hold my breath till I die. Rather than explode like a steam boiler, I will rein in my feelings, and if she will simply relieve my uncertainty, I'll surrender and die." Now, note, if the captain actually did surrender, as he suggests here, if he no longer resisted, there would be no tragedy here, because after all, the tragedy is rooted in the resistance, in the fighting against these forces, no matter how hopeless the struggle might be. Well, although the captain does at times quietly submit in a kind of stoical manner, as he suggests, at other moments his helpless rage and indignation explode like that steam boiler he described, because he, in exploding, is striking out against Laura and against the female dominance that will destroy him, but which he refuses much of the time to bow to. Now, Laura has been eavesdropping on the conversation with the doctor I just read, and the captain knows this. When he confronts her, he does so to accuse her of subverting his work, which he suspected, and of trying to drive him insane, which she realizes she's been trying to do for many years. Quote, "You have gnawed and nibbled at my mind so that it will soon slip the cogs and the whole mental mechanism will go smash. This is the approaching insanity you are waiting for, Laura." But in saying this, the captain acknowledges Laura's victory, surrenders to her power, and offers her terms of what he calls peace. Now, curiously, the captain, in the passages I've just quoted, speaks of what she has done to him calmly and rationally, speaks rationally, paradoxically, about the loss of his reason and judgment, reflectively. He asks only one thing of Laura in exchange for this surrender, and that is that she relieve his uncertainty about whether or not he is Bertha's father. The problem is, however, that he has played this very badly. He has already conceded defeat to her, so he has no leverage. And so rather than relieving his pain as a kind of quid pro quo, Laura instead tortures him with the very uncertainty that he cannot bear. Now, when the captain said, "I offer peace," Laura says the conditions, "that I may keep my reason, free me from my suspicions, and I give up the conflict." What suspicions? About Bertha's origin. Are there any doubts about that? Yes, I have doubts, and you have awakened them, Laura. I? Yes, you have dropped them like henbane in my ears, and circumstances have strengthened them. Free me from the uncertainty. Tell me outright that it is true, and I will forgive you beforehand. But how can I acknowledge a sin that I have not committed? What does it matter that you know that I shall not divulge it? Do you think a man would go and spread his own shame and broadcast it? To which Laura says, "If I say it's true, you won't be convinced. But if I say it is, then you will be convinced. You seem to hope that it is true. You seem to hope that you're not her father." To which the captain says, "Yes, strangely enough, it must be, because the first suppositions can't be proved, but the latter can. Laura, save me and save my reason. You don't seem to understand what I say. If the child is not mine, I have no control over her and don't want to have any. And that is precisely what you do want, isn't it?" Okay. Now, note here, essentially the captain is begging Laura to tell him that Laura is not his child, and thereby relieve the anxiety, because he assumes if she tells him that, it would be true. But the problem, as Laura realizes it, is that if she says that the captain is the father, then he won't be able to believe her because she has lied so often. He could more readily believe her if she said she isn't Bertha's father. Now, that would be agony in itself, because the captain has invested so much hope in Bertha. He calls her his soul. He says she's his only legacy, but she's not going to give him that painful certainty. The captain says, "I do not believe in a hereafter. The child was my future life." Note the "was." That was my conception of immortality, and perhaps the only one that has any analogy in reality. If you take that away from me, you cut off my life, but clearly he took away the belief in the immortality of that child as his own, and cut off his life, then leave him in this agonizing state of doubt. And yet that is precisely what she does. The captain says he could endure the loss of his belief in Bertha as his immortality. It would be like the loss of a limb. He could bear also the loss of legal authority over her. He could bear the emasculating humiliation of being a cuckold. All those things, miserable as they are, he could bear if only Laura would end his agony of doubt and tell him, "No, you're not the father." So paradoxically then, the captain is reduced to begging Laura to tell him that she slept with another man who fathered the child that he thought was his. But Laura, of course, with her boundless malice and resentment, refuses even to offer him this strange act of mercy in exchange for his surrender. She knows that the captain won't believe her if she says that he's the father now. And the maddening agony of doubt, her refusal to tell him, "You're not the father," is exactly what she knows will extend his torment and what will, at the same time, by doing so, drive him further and further into madness. "Who is the father?" the captain demands. "You," Laura says. "No, I'm not. Here is a buried crime that begins to stink, and what a hellish crime." Oh, now you're quite mad, she says. Yes, and that madness is deepening because she refuses to give him the certainty that he desires. Now, since the captain has surrendered so abjectly, you might ask, well, what is it that moves Laura to extend his suffering, to tighten the screw this way? If she now has power over Bertha, if she is on the verge of having him declared mad and gaining legal authority under patriarchy, why continue to torment him? Well, there's something very deeply personal about this hatred that goes beyond Darwinian or Strindberg's appropriation of the Darwinian struggle between species, in this case men and women. And the answer to what it is that is so personal for her and that motivates her aggression against the captain, I think at least as much as the fundamental antagonism of men and women and the struggle for Bertha, is this. It comes out in a perverse exchange in Act 2. When the captain says, weeping, "Why shouldn't a man complain? A soldier, why shouldn't he weep? Because it's unmanly? Why? Why is it unmanly?" He's utterly humiliated. "Weep then, my child," Laura says, "as if you were with your mother once more. Do you remember when I first came into your life? I was like a second mother. Your great, strong body needed nerves. You were like a giant child that had either come too early into the world or perhaps was not wanted at all." Yes, that's how it was, the captain says. My father's and my mother's will was against my coming into the world, and consequently I was born without a will. I thought I was completing myself when you and I became one, and therefore you were allowed to rule, and I, the commander of the barracks and before the troops, became obedient to you, grew through you, looked up to you as to a more highly gifted being, listened to you as if I had been your undeveloped child. Laura says, yes, that's the way it was, and therefore I loved you as my child. But you know, you must have seen, when the nature of your feelings changed and you appeared as my lover, that I blushed, and your embraces were joy that was followed by a remorseful conscience, as if my blood were ashamed. The mother became the mistress. Ugh! To which the captain says, I saw it, but I did not understand. I believed that you despised me for my unmanliness, and I wanted to win you as a woman by becoming a man. Sexually, to which Laura then says, yes, but that was your mistake. The mother was your friend, you see, but the woman was your enemy, and love between the sexes is strife. The captain says, you always had an advantage. So she did. Now let's consider the advantage, the female advantage, and how it plays in here. According to this account, the captain's biological mother never wanted him, and he saw in Laura, even perhaps more than in the nurse, the maternal figure he craved but never really had. As an adult, he related to Laura as a dependent child would, and this gratified Laura's desire for power over him and for a kind of maternal bond with him. But when the captain felt the need to assert himself as a mature man, to demonstrate to her his masculine independence by making the relationship sexual, Laura began to hate him. She admits that the sex gave her physical pleasure at first, physical delight, but she says that pleasure quickly became a problem. It filled her momentarily thereafter with guilt and disgust because the sex seemed to her incestuous. She regarded him as her big boy, as her child. She'd thought of him that way, and so now when they had sex, she felt that the mother had become the mistress. Incestuous. Now, unlike Phaedra, note, Laura is definitely not erotically aroused by the thought of incest. Quite the opposite. And curiously, the captain, too, feels that this was a kind of incest, but feels no particular guilt for it. That's odd. He feels no guilt for the incest. She feels angry and guilty for it. And it is a curious inversion of Freud's theory of the Oedipal relationship, in which the male child desires his mother. Within that scheme, it is the male child who feels guilty for his sexual desire for the mother and fears the father's punishment, where the mother doesn't. Here, it is the mother figure who does, and the son figure, the captain, who seems to carry with him no guilt for that. Now, Laura also resents the captain's sexual overture because it was a challenge to her maternal power over him. He tried to assert himself through sex. Ever since then, Laura has resented the captain then, both for his attempt to assert male independence and resent him for the guilt that he made her feel when he sexualized their relationship. And this is why Laura's revenge then goes beyond just taking control of Bertha, beyond striking out at patriarchy, and beyond the parameters of the male-female antagonism in nature. It's deeply personal as well. And so what she really wants in inflicting pain on the captain is to punish him for that sexualization of their relationship by reducing him to his original state of helpless childishness with her. And to do this, she works to destroy his mature mind. And also she works to emasculate him, as if by doing so to punish his sexual self-assertion. In short, Laura wants to inflict a kind of figurative castration on the captain to punish him for his sexual crime that she cannot forgive. And the captain understands this, I think, to his horror. He says, "I realized that my honor had been corrupted, and I wanted to blot out the memory by a great deed, an achievement, a discovery, an honorable suicide. I wanted to go to war, but was not permitted. It was then that I threw myself into science, and now, when I am about to reach out my hand and gather the fruits of my work, you chop off my arm. I wonder what men get when they grow old and cease to be men." Chop off the arm, cease to be men. He feels emasculated by the way in which he has subverted his work and his life. Those who crowed were no longer cocks, but capons. And that's what he feels like, as if he's no longer a cock, but one that has been castrated. A capon, nothing more. Now, despite Laura's aversion to sex and guilt for enjoying it and disgust at the incestuous sense that it gave her, despite that, she knows that without sex, she wouldn't have Bertha. She says she would prefer pregnancy didn't require a male. But since it does, and since the captain has thereby fulfilled his function, she tells him at the end of this conversation, "Now you have fulfilled your function and you are no longer needed anymore, and so you must go." What does she mean by go? Go, perhaps to an insane asylum, because remember, she's already at this point fabricated a letter sent to the board about his lunacy, okay? But go might also mean go in the sense of cease to exist, to die, which at the end of the play, the captain seems to be very much on the verge of. Well, the captain's response to Laura's treachery and to her refusal to grant him the peaceful surrender in the certainty of knowing that he's not Bertha's father, her treachery and her refusal there cause him, in a peak of frustration, to throw the lighted lamp at her. Of course, he misses. And this illuminated lamp is very often, such symbols in literary text, symbols of reason, of illumination, of intelligence. But at this moment, of course, in throwing it, the captain extinguishes that light. And fittingly, because he has lost his male intellectual ability to see the world clearly, to think coherently, as he descends now at a more and more accelerated rate into complete madness. His impulsive act of flinging the lamp in an act of rage is also futile insofar as he had promised the doctor that, like an old Roman, he would simply lie and surrender with his hands over his breast. He violates that promise. He said, I'm not going to explode like a boiler. But here he does explode. He cannot acquire or cannot live by the kind of quiet dignity of that old Roman he describes. And yet, as I've suggested, if he did, there would be no tragedy. Tragedy demands this attempt in some way to oppose that which is more powerful. Under Laura's merciless assault, he can't live up to a stoical ideal, and he can't maintain his grip on sanity. Okay,